Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this session of the Tennessee History Day Starter Pack series. This series was developed because we had a lot of educators asking for very specific PD things that have to do with the beginnings of your History Day process, but also digging into topics that are often not hit in some PD that are good to know either as you're getting started or as you are working towards expanding what History Day looks like for you and your kids, as well as the type of learning that takes place with History Day. So the series exists in person, but also online. All the sessions are recorded and are available for PD if you watch the recording. So if you're watching the recording, hello. Tonight, we are going to be hearing from Chris Grisham, who is the K-12 Education Manager at the Tennessee State Museum. Chris has a background in education. He was an elementary classroom educator and then has been at the State Museum for, I think, 15 years now. So he has been on the classroom side of things and also the museum work of working with objects, because tonight we're going to be talking about using objects as primary sources, not just in History Day, but also just in the classroom. How do you pull that type of discussion and learning into your classroom setting? And then I'm going to come in with some information on, okay, how do we apply this to something like a History Day project? So this is kind of the agenda for the evening. My name's Nikki. I'm the state coordinator. I should introduce myself. My name's Nikki. I'm the state coordinator of Tennessee History Day. And you've heard from me if you've watched other recordings. So lucky for you, I'm only going to talk a little bit towards the end. Chris is going to walk us through some of the stuff that the museum has for these types of activities, as well as kind of an example of that learning strategy. And then I'm going to talk about using that with National History Day. I'll point out some resources at the end as well. A few things as we get started: make sure your mic is muted and rename yourself so we know who's here with us. And use the chat if you'd like to tell us where you're joining from, or if you have questions. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat as we go, and we'll use those questions at the end. Courtney is here as well. Courtney is the assistant coordinator. She's over in East Tennessee, and she is going to be helping with that too. If you view this session either live or recorded, make sure to fill out the linked survey that's on the Padlet. I will share in the chat, in the email, everywhere you talk with me, you will get a link to that. And that information is what is used on your PD certificate. So if you work at Goodlettsville Middle School, please don't write GMS, because I need to know what needs to go on the certificate. So type out your full school name. As well, if you go in and take if you watch any of the other sessions, I try to check those weekly. Sometimes it's every 2 weeks when things are crazy. And if you're expecting something and it doesn't come through, please email me and I'll get it to you. I'm going to show these again later, but the general educator Padlet has links to the starter pack stuff as well as a ton of other things. So if you're not familiar with it, please make sure you take a look. And then this is the Starter Pack Series Padlet that has the recorded sessions. They're highlighted in orange. And then resources down below from that session. So sometimes PowerPoint slides, things like that. And then at the very beginning, you'll fill out the form that is there for PD credit. So I'm going to quit talking and stop my screen share and let Chris take over.
All right. Thank you for having me, and thank you guys for all logging in and watching recorded. What I'm going to try to do is kind of break this up into chunks. So I want to start off talking about kind of why we should use 3D objects as primary sources. What are some of the benefits that come with that, as far as mixing them in along with the things that you're probably much more familiar with using, like written letters, diary entries, legal documents, things like that, as well as pictures, video, audio clips, things that we're a little more familiar with analyzing sometimes. So why it's important to mix the 3D objects in. Then we'll get into a way that you can help your students analyze objects in a really kind of educationally rich way. And then what happens once you have these objects and you've analyzed them, what can you do with them? So I kind of want to work my way through that. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and start share my screen as long as that functionally works. And we'll see if that does. All right, can everybody see that? Excellent. So one of the big things is, first of all, artifacts are primary sources too. That we like to say that, being in a museum that deals with 3D objects and artifacts, it's not just written things, it's not just pictures, but artifacts get to be those primary sources as well. And one of the reasons that you could use these is they hit the SSPs. If you're in Tennessee, they are definitely in every grade level when it talks about using information or gathering information from a primary source. Artifacts are listed as one of those. So it's definitely in there. And it's a good way to rip, like I said, kind of, and they're in as part of a mix. You want to use as many different primary sources as you can. Also, there's a good way to kind of work them into other grade levels if you're looking for something cross-curricular. Some of the ELA standards or thought processes and some of the STEM processes that that you kind of work your way through. Some of the same problem solving and analyzing skills that are in both of those can be used on 3D objects on primary sources. So it's a good way to kind of also bring in some of those other elements or at least reinforce some of the processes that you use in other topics. But really, the biggest thing, some of the biggest reasons why you want to use primary sources is because you want to tell a more complete story of history. This quote here from the director of the British Museum is a really good one. You guys can read that. But if you want to tell the history of the world, a history that does not unduly privilege one part of humanity, you cannot do it through text alone. Because only some of the world has ever had text, and while most of the world, for most of the time, has not. So text-based primary sources only exist in certain places for a certain amount of time. Um, 3D objects have lasted a lot longer. Talking about Tennessee history, Sequoia created the Cherokee syllabary. It gets adopted by the tribal nation in 1825. Prior to that, there is no Cherokee written record. We have some Cherokee learned English or other languages and would write things in there. And we also have information about the Cherokee from Europeans who observed there. So you're getting it through that white lens. But if you want to talk about Cherokee history prior to 1825, you pretty much have to use 3D objects. So it just opens up the door to a lot of what could otherwise be marginalized groups and communities in history. And to that point, also, just anything older than written text, just period, in human history. The early part of human history, more than 95% of humanity's story can only be told in stone or bone or these things that have survived over time. Anything prior to written human history, which is a lot of human history, is going to have to be told through 3D objects. So it definitely opens up just a lot more avenues to take a look at from any kind of, and not just world Civ, ancient Civ in Tennessee. Like I said, we have a prehistoric period in Tennessee, just like every other part of the world does. So prior to written record. So one of the biggest things is just generally it's a great way to tell a very complete story. Other than that, we're not going to do the activity since we are virtual, but once you've decided you want to incorporate 3D objects and artifacts in, there's really just a couple of steps that you kind of have to go through with your students. One is just to deeply observe. Just let them explore an object, see what they see, feel it if it's something that they can have physically in their hands, and really just deeply analyze and just observe without putting too much thought into it. Start with basic observation. The activity that I'll show you guys a little bit later, that's really what we're going to do. We're going to start with basic observation. Then you analyze. Then that's when you break into asking questions. Ask about the object. What kind of things are you trying to figure out? What information do you need from that object to be able to draw certain conclusions? And then the last part that we're going to do, that kind of third part, once you've analyzed the objects, is then you have to put them in their context. Where did these objects come from? How would they have been used? And what does that tell us about the world that they come from, the time period, the place, the history that it comes from? So we're going to do a little bit of each of these a little bit later, and I'll show you guys how we do them here at the museum with students and how you guys can use them in your classrooms as well. But the observation are some basic things. We'll get into these questions when I kind of walk us through the activity. But the observations can be as basic as, what is it made out of? What does this object contain? What is its material? And that by itself gives us a certain piece of information. If you have an object made out of plastic, you automatically know a certain time period, because it's a man-made material. If it's made out of stone, if it's made out of wood, if it's made out of bone, if it's made out of all kinds of materials, that can tell you a lot about the object just right off the bat with such a basic question. Um, and also, I will say artifacts, generally, we consider artifacts anything man-made, technically fossils, yeah, which, you can argue about this if you'd like. I know at our museum, we have people that have different philosophies. Technically, fossils and things like that don't count as artifacts because they are not man-made. So the design aspect of it, so if artifacts are man-made, that means that every part of the design is actually chosen on purpose. Every part of that design was a decision that was purposefully made by whoever created that object. And that purpose can be function or it can be form. The purpose of certain parts can be decorative. But by looking at those and really observing and seeing how the design of the object was created, is going to tell you a lot about the function of the object, the use of the object, and the person who created it as well. This also is a great way to kind of get into some STEM aspects, because if you are designing, say, a tool, is your object, it was a tool that was used to do a specific job. Why was it designed the way that it was? How does it help do that job once you figure out what the job is? Why do you think there would be different kinds of tools? Does one type of axe versus a different type of axe make a difference in the job that it does? Things like that. So you can even incorporate design and technology elements and STEM elements into this when you're really observing those designs. And then basic observations of just, are there any markings on it? Are there things that any damage, any things that might have been put on there on accident, on purpose? And what does that tell us about it as well? So the observation and the asking questions is a very important part. And it's also, like I said, kind of cross-curricular. You're going to use a lot of these same thought processes, analyzing skills in different aspects. Context is, of course, the other important part. Basically, once you have figured out what your object is, what it was for, and roughly when it was from, then you now are starting to build that context. If it has a specific function, why? Why was that a job that needed to be done? How did this object help do that? How would people have used it? And what does that tell us about the people and their everyday life? And who made it? Was it a valuable item to them? All of those are going to be a big part of that as well. So that building that context is really going to help. Um, some of these you can kind of look at this, finding the artifact stories, building that context. These artifacts do have a story. So again, this is kind of what I've been talking about already, trying to put it in that context. Now, sometimes this does use a little bit of imagination by your students. They have to kind of build that world in their head. So background information, if they already have it, is going to be important here. But honestly, even if they're coming to some of these objects completely fresh, they're still going to be able to use these to kind of populate that world, and they can be walked through through a broader context as well. So when you think about the artifacts, I mentioned that I said earlier that they have their stories. They have different stories, different ways to think about these artifacts, because every artifact has its own story. Why was this particular object saved? Who saved it? How did it end up where it is? For example, if it's in our museum, How did it end up in the museum? How did it get to us? Was it passed down by a family? Was it preserved and saved purposefully for for display, for people to learn from? Um, Artifacts connect people, and this is true of any primary source, but they can really connect people. If it was something that was used or made by someone in the past and you are analyzing it in the present, there is a connection to that. And usually you can also, like with a lot of things, you can kind of make a timeline of how does this connect to things that we maybe still use or still have today? Or is it something that we don't still have today? Is whatever job or need that artifact served gone away? Is that not something we deal with in the present? But it can connect people across time. Artifacts mean a lot of things. I'm going to talk about that kind of specifically a little bit later and get into that. They do capture moments every bit as much as a letter or a picture or anything like that can do. And again, they can reflect changes, especially if you have many artifacts. And we'll talk about how you can really compound these kind of activities and the context and the learning that's going to be done by looking at multiple artifacts, not just one. How does that give us a more complete picture? So artifacts mean many things. This is one of my favorite objects to use in the museum with students when we are talking about the different perspectives that an artifact might have. This is a Conestoga style wagon that we have in the museum. First, it does have its own story. This wagon was actually used by a family to move into Tennessee in the early 1800s. They brought it across the mountains, I believe from North Carolina, and it brought them in here as they settled into this new western area. This wagon also eventually took them even further west. The family actually went to Texas in this wagon, and then I believe in the 1830s brought it back to Tennessee as they came back. So these idea of patterns of settlement and people movement, this object tells that story. This object has that story. This object went from place to place and brought a family with them. It can connect to people. First thing I ask kids when they're sitting in front of me looking at this object, how many of you have ever moved? Did you rent a U-Haul? Did you pack all your stuff in it? How did you decide what you were going to bring with you, what you were going to leave behind? What if you only had one U-Haul? What if you only had one wagon? How would that change the decision of what you're going to bring with you? Those were the kind of things that this family that rode in this wagon into Tennessee had to also think about. So it can make those connections. The capturing moments, the reflect changes, kind of going back to this was a moment in time when Tennessee was new, how people would have come into here. And obviously, we do things a little differently, but not entirely, right? People move. You still get a big old truck, you throw all your stuff in it and pack up. That is not wildly different. Now, how you do that, how long it takes, that has changed. So they can reflect the change. But the object meaning many things. One of the things I like so much about this object is if you are looking at this from the perspective of the white European settlers who came into the Tennessee, or American at that point, white American settlers that were coming over the mountains, this wagon symbolizes a fresh start, new opportunities, maybe even hope. They are coming into this area for a reason, whether that is to just a change of scenery, whether it was they felt like they had the opportunity to maybe purchase some land or basically increase their family's wealth or just survive better over here. This wagon has a lot of meaning to that family that was bringing it over here. Like I said, prosperity, hope, a new beginning, whatever that would be imbued with. However, if you are Native American and in Tennessee and you see these wagons coming across the mountains, it has a very different perspective for you. Native Americans looking at these wagons coming over these are going to be a symbol of encroachment, of loss of land, of possibly conflict as new neighbors move in. It could even be opportunity. Some of the earliest wagons, new neighbors coming in, trade routes had already developed between the settlers on the other side of the mountain and Native Americans over here. Maybe this was an economic opportunity until too many people start to come over. So it even depends on the time period. But Native Americans are going to have a very different perspective on this particular object when they look at their history. And same is true with African Americans. Most African Americans that came into Tennessee in early days did not come by choice. They would have been walking behind wagons like this as enslaved workers that were being brought in. While some free African Americans did move into Tennessee, this wagon would mean for very much like it did for white families for them. But if you were an enslaved African American, this wagon is not that same symbol of hope and fresh start for you. If you come in enslaved, like I said, this is a dangerous frontier area. You did not have a choice to make that trip. You did not make that decision to come in. This wagon is going to symbolize something very different. So it's one object, but it is telling a lot of different stories from different perspectives. So this is one of my favorite to really kind of hammer home what objects can do for students and for teachers as well. Now, as far as the design elements and the analyzing, you can get into why it was designed the way it is. The slanted sides and the curved bottom made this a perfect vehicle to travel over mountains. As they start to go up and down inclines, these high slanted sides helped keep your stuff in the wagon. The curved bottom also kind of kept things centered as well. So these Conestoga style wagons are going to be very different than chuck wagons that will go out west that you've seen if you've ever seen Little House on the Prairie, any of those movie shows. The very standard kind of box wagons, those work on flat plains. They don't work as well in the mountains. So you can get into the design elements of this. The smaller front wheels, the larger back wheels. The smaller front wheels aid in maneuverability. They can turn better. So you can talk about a STEM aspect with that. You'll notice there's no seat on this. No, you do not ride this wagon and guide it from a sitting position. You would either be walking in front of the animals that are pulling it and guiding them that way, or sometimes behind the smaller front wheel there would be a standing board that you would stand on. But most likely, you're going to be walking beside this. The toolbox would contain that you can see in the middle there would contain tools that you would use to work on the wagon. And it's hard to tell in a picture, but this wagon is also modular. This could be broken down if you unloaded. Let's say you were crossing a river. Once it's unloaded, you could take this entire wagon apart in about 30 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes, and then take the pieces across the river and put it back together. So it was designed to come apart and be put together very, very quickly. And that was so you could move it through rougher terrain. So those are all important aspects in the design of this object. Now, I will say, I always put this, give this asterisk. There are limitations to 3D objects sometimes. For example, this is an image that was given of a rhinoceros that was drawn by someone who was just kind of describing a rhinoceros. So you can see, you look at it and you can be like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that is a rhinoceros. But there's problems with it, right? So sometimes with these 3D objects, if you don't have any context at all, it's easy to draw wrong conclusions. So if you were describing a horned beast like this with thick skin, you may come up with a drawing that looks very much like this. One of my favorite versions of these limitations, though, comes from a book called The Motel of Mysteries, which envisioned a future archaeologist uncovering what was at the time in 1979 a present day motel. And they found this sacred urn. The most holy of relics was discovered in the inner chamber. It was carved from a single piece of porcelain and highly polished. The urn was a focal point of the burial ceremony. The ranking celebrant kneeling before the urn would chant into it while water from the sacred spring flowed into mix with the sheets of sacred parchment. It is a toilet. Which if you are talking about a time period where you move past using toilets, then you suddenly discover a motel and every room has one of these in it. It is going to seem very, very important. And archaeologists do like to use the ceremonial term for things that they're not real sure what it's for sometimes. Must have been used in a ceremony. So yes, I will say when giving and this is the asterisk I always put, when you are working with students with an object, make sure it is an object that either they can put into context in some way or you can provide the context if they start going down the wrong road. Because it is easy to look at some of these things and be like, well, this must be what it is, because that's the first idea that popped into your head. And actually, let's jump to the activity. See if I can pull that up. Are you guys seeing the sheet that says Artifact Detective? Perfect. So this is actually an activity we do here at the museum with students where we divide them up into groups and we give each of them an object that they probably are not familiar with. We try to give them something that they wouldn't be able to guess immediately. And this is just a guiding sheet. So if you were going to do something like this with your students, this is something you could use as well. And the idea is that these first three questions that you see at the top, what is it, when is it from, and who used it, that is what we're trying to discover. That is our ultimate goal. And the rest of it is going to be questions that are hopefully going to get you to those answers. But what I always tell students, the hardest thing to do when you first look at an object is try not to guess. Do not guess immediately. You want to have as blank a slate in your mind as possible. Because if you look at something and go, oh, well, clearly that's a pencil, then every answer to your questions here will lead you to that conclusion you've already drawn. So that is the hardest part, is trying to keep that open mind. But again, starting with that basic question, what is it made out of? And we have some options here that are most common for our objects. But again, that's going to lead you to certain answers. If it is fabric, that is going to give me a different possible use than if it's made out of pottery. Not a lot of things are going to, jobs can be done by things made out of both of those. Plastic, glass, if it's made out of those materials, then that's definitely after a time when that would have been common or invented. Things like that, cardboard versus bone, are going to give me different pieces of information. One thing we always ask is it complete? And there's two ways to think of this. Is it complete? Some things just get broken. Objects are old, they are not always taken care of, and they can be broken. So some things might just be missing. Also, though, is it complete? One example I give to students is video games, a video game system. If you have an Xbox and a controller, those are two complete objects in and of themselves, but you really have to have both to make it work. So even though neither of them are broken, they're not really complete without each other. So sometimes you will get objects that need another thing to function correctly. Are the materials natural or man-made? Again, there's a big difference between bone and plastic in your objects, things like that. Was it made by hand or by machine? That again, if nothing else, leads me to time frame. Is it something that could have been made at home by hand, people would have made themselves, or is it something that was mass produced by a machine? And then how do you know that? Um, Machine, a lot of students will say if something was made by machine because it's very exact. It seems very uniform all the way across. It seems like there's really high detail work on certain things, which absolutely can be done by hand, especially with somebody who knows what they're doing. But certain things that are stamped out and mass produced have that look to them. So sometimes that's how they know. Then we start to get into our kind of leading into those answers. Like, okay, so given that information, how old do you think this is? Just start with an estimate. Don't try to find a specific time period. Just start with a basic estimate. How old do you think this thing might be? Do you think it was an object of value? And that can mean two different things there as well. Value can be, it's worth a lot of money. It's made out of gold and precious jewels and all this other stuff. Things that were just stolen from the Louvre. Those were objects of value. Or they're valuable because they're useful. Is it valuable to somebody because they need it? A plunger does not cost a lot of money, but when you need one, it is a very valuable object to have in your house. So is it something that was just useful, or is it and that made it valuable, or is it valuable intrinsically? It has a value. And then kind of leading into that, was it useful? Do you think this is something that was used a lot? Do you think it was something that was used rarely? Do you think it was when it was needed, it was something that like lots of people needed to have, or would it be something that you only needed if you were maybe had a specific job? Things like that. Was it a tool that is specific to a certain craftsman or something like that? Do you think the object was used for work or fun? Toys, games have existed forever. So, yeah, are these things that are something that are useful for fun, or are they useful for work? And then we get into trying to answer those questions. How do you think it was used? Could it be used today? What for? Does it look like something that exists today? Does it have something in common with things that exist today? Um, Also, one thing I ask students, and this isn't something we necessarily put on the sheet, I ask them to hold it. Just hold the object up like you were using it. And most of the time, the students will figure out what the top and the bottom is. They will figure out if there's handles on it, things like that. And honestly, just by if they just instinctively grab it, they are usually holding it correctly. And that can lead to an epiphany as to what that object is a lot of times. Because sometimes just knowing what the top of a thing is very useful. And then one thing we ask, what more information do you need about that object? Are there anything, if there's any pieces of information that if you had that, that would help you figure this out? So these are some very basic questions. So we have the students go through these with their objects, and then we ask them to come up and answer these questions. Okay, so what do you think it is, or at least what do you think it, and what do you think it does? About when do you think it's from, and who do you think would have used it? And if they can do that, that means they are putting it into some sort of context. They figured out the job, the thing that it is doing, who might have used it, and when that was. They are building that context. That's what we're trying to get them to. And let's see. This is one way to analyze an individual object. So talked about kind of why it's important and how that can be useful. Talked about a way to analyze an object. So next, you see the thing that says Frontier Life? That's on the screen. Perfect. Um, then this is what you would do with multiple objects. So once you've put something in context, this is actually a virtual program that we offer where we actually show students virtually several objects. We hold them up to the camera, we let them observe them, and then they have to tell us. Then basically, the idea is not only are they trying to guess what these objects are, but we want them to tell a story with these objects. So once you have multiple objects, you're building out more and more of that context, and it helps you to tell that story. So, for example, this is the one that we do for Frontier Life. So, we're talking about Tennessee around the time of statehood. And we have several objects that would have been commonly found in a household at that time. This one, I'm not going to make you guys analyze these, but this is a candle mold. It's made out of metal. It's got these little holes in the top. You pour the wax in, you put the wick through, and solidify, and you have made candles. We have cotton cards or wool carding that you would use to comb out cotton or wool to get out anything that's in there that you don't want. For example, cotton has the seeds or the husks, things like that, the dried out leaves. You want that out of there, but you also want all the fibers combed in one direction so you can then turn around and spin that into yarn or thread, things like that. These are made out of wood with metal teeth, usually kind of on the flat sides. We have a mortar and pestle used to grind things up, pretty straightforward. And as a matter of fact, we still use today. A chamber pot, which gets less used today now that we have those sacred urns from earlier. But chamber pot, for people to use the restroom in the middle of the night, you don't want to go to the outhouse. So this would serve that purpose. I won't get too much into the purpose. You guys know that. A butter mold used to shape your butter, cover your butter, and when you would push it out, they usually put these little graphic designs that you see on the inside so that as you lift, you kind of push down so the butter stays on the table. But it also puts that nice little pattern on there and it makes it all pretty, makes your butter pretty. Again, some elements are just decorative, not necessarily. The stopper is functional because it pushes the butter out of the mold so it doesn't stick in there. But hey, if you're going to do that, might as well make it pretty while you're at it. A bed key, which would be used to tighten ropes that held up mattresses on a wood bed frame. If you've ever heard the term good night sleep tight, that is what the bed key refers to, tightening the ropes under your mattress so your bed would stay nice and level and flat while you slept in it. And then a drop spindle here as well, which is after you've carded your cotton. This is what mostly kids would have used to spin that cotton. Mom would have been using a spinning wheel or a walking wheel. Kids would have used a drop spindle to make spin that raw material, the raw fibers of cotton or wool, into that yarn or thread, whatever it is they're making. So we would have the kids analyze each of these objects and then put them all out in front of them. And what stories can you tell with this? Um, and there's several. It doesn't have to be just one thing. Generally, you can talk about chores on the frontier. Candle making is a chore. You need candles because you don't have electric lights. You have to be able to see away from the fireplace somehow. Candles are going to be very important. Cotton carding, this would have been a chore done by children for the most part. Everybody would have done it, but kids would have done it pretty well. Mortar and pestle, this is a cooking implement. You had to do the cooking yourself on the frontier. Chamber pot, using it not so much a chore. Generally, kids though would have been the one that would have cleaned this. That would have been one of the first things they had to do before they, when they woke up in the morning, is to empty out and clean out the chamber pot. You don't want that just staying there all day. Again, a food implement, bed key. The last chore most kids would have done before going to bed is tightening up their bed. And then drop spindle, again, this would have been used by kids. So you could even talk about just kids' life. Pull a few of these objects out and talk about life for kids on the frontier. What were they doing? You can talk about economics, raw materials to finished product with some of these. Your candle mold turns wax into a product, candles, cotton cards and the drop spindle to making our processes in making clothes, taking raw materials you would have grown or raised on the farm, turning them into a finished product, things like that. You can talk about the materials that were available. They had things made out of metal, made out of wood, made out of porcelain, and so on. But again, most of these are going to be wood, porcelain, things like that, or pottery. Um, you're not going to have a ton of metal things. You're not going to have any plastic. You're not going to have a lot of glass either. Um, so you can talk about the materials, using the materials that were around. These are all things that would have been made by hand, probably. Or well, definitely by hand. A lot of these might have been made in the home. You might have somebody, you might buy a candle mold instead of making it yourself, but you could have made some of these make pottery, heat it over a fire, and you can make your own chamber pot. You can whittle some of this stuff out of wood, things like that. So some of these could have been made in the home by hand. So if you broke it, you'd make another one using your own raw materials. There's lots of different ways we can take these few objects, or at least pick and choose from these few objects, and start to build a broader context that we can tell a story from. So ultimately, that's one of the ways you can benefit from adding 3D objects into your primary source usage. So if you are reading the Little House on the Prairie books as, oh, this is what life was like on the frontier, yeah, you could read someone who lived through it and they wrote stories and they kind of describe the life, but then add these objects in, and it really brings to life, maybe how hard life was or how much work people had to do to survive on the frontier. How different life was when you couldn't just run to a store and buy things, or well, you don't have to run to the store today. You can get on Amazon and buy things, and they will bring it right to your house. But these objects can really bring home those personal stories. And again, you can look at these from different perspectives as well, and see what kind of different ideas they open up for the kids. So this is a good addition to primary sources you may already be using. So analyzing objects uses a lot of great thought processes, things that you may be teaching in other ways. You can introduce STEM, you can do all these other things, but also it's just increasing their observational skills, taking those ideas, putting them into context, building out that context with other objects to really get a true picture of what life was like at different times. So hopefully this will help you guys use some of these objects in your classroom with your students. The biggest downside, I will say, to 3D objects and using them in your classroom is you have to have them. And that is the hard part. You can, if you'd like to just have some in your classroom, honestly, flea markets, antique stores, anywhere you go that has a bunch of stalls of stuff, you can find pretty old stuff, or at least newer versions of old things where people have made, craftsmen have made things. People like to make things the old-fashioned way. And you can get some of those things yourselves. You can come to museums. We have a traveling trunk program where we will ship out trunks with 3D objects or replica objects, and in some cases, real objects, to teachers that they can use in their classroom. And we're not the only museum that has that, that offers it. So you can look into those. If you would like to get by with just pictures, us and a lot of other museums as well, have big chunks of our collection available online. At our website, you can actually just go to search our collection and you can type in what it is you're looking for and find images of those things along with descriptions. So 3D objects, the biggest downside is having them. Is like physically, you have to, if you want the students to really use them and hold them in their hands, that is going to be the harder part. It is a lot easier to find scanned in documents and pictures and things like that nowadays than it is to get a hold of a 3D object. But there are resources out there, and I will gladly answer questions about where you can find those if you have them. But hopefully, this will help you guys see a benefit and maybe a useful way to incorporate these into your classroom, into what you guys are already doing.
Thank you. I was taking notes of things I wanted to kind of jump off of as you were talking, because I think, let me share my screen again too. I think one of the challenges of objects in primary source analysis, and educators that are here with us, you can tell me if I am off base, because again, I feel like my pre-COVID student classroom experience is no longer relevant at all because the world is the classroom's so different. But I think one of the biggest challenges is, like you said, kind of taking for granted understanding an object. Like, you can't just the first thing that pops into your head, or being like, oh, well, that's just a mortar and pestle. Like, I know what that is. 3D objects require more research sometimes because they don't tell on themselves. They don't um, they don't walk you there. If you're reading a letter from someone and they talk about how much they love biscuits, and their family have biscuits at least 3 times a week, and they're kind of talking about this with somebody in a letter, that's different than seeing the actual biscuit cutter that was used by whoever's doing that cooking, whether that's a family member or an enslaved person, and seeing the wear on that object to show the use of it, how much it was used, how often it was used. It requires a different type of thinking sometimes. So, how do we pair that with NHD? Um, Chris shared his slides a little earlier, so I was able to kind of use those as I brainstormed ways to use this in the classroom. So, referencing materials outside of them not telling on themselves, right? And to be fair, not all written or photographs or things like that tell on themselves. They also require their own types of research, but you have a little more something to go off of when it's not a 3D object. How do you cite objects? That is something to pay attention to with your students, and that is relative to whichever style guide they're using. But also, how do we refer to those objects in the project? How do I make an argument using a pitcher, right? Like a pouring pitcher. How do I make an argument using a biscuit cutter? How does that fold into the point that I'm making? And to speak to what Chris had said, context is key. Context is the point of using a 3D object. It's especially important for material culture with National History Day projects. This new dimension of source type can be a good stretch for students, but it adds value if we're especially thinking about the rubric, the wide research category, as you pointed out, multiple perspectives. Sometimes there are perspectives in history that we can only find through objects and not written language or art that still exists. So how do we use those in the project? Well, for the kid, the challenge is, what is this object helping you prove? Why make a point to bring this up in your research? Understanding that item enough to be able to make a point. And I think your challenge as the educator is practicing analysis of 3D objects, getting them comfortable enough with it to be able to talk about it with authority in their project. And some of the things that you pointed out, like, socioeconomics when we're looking at an object, how did they get that item? Was it expensive? Is that an item that would have been a big deal for them to have, or did they have a lot of expensive items because they were wealthy? That speaks to their status. It speaks to the culture, whether cultural and like the diffusion of culture. Is this something that shouldn't be in Middle Tennessee, or is it something that is from Middle Tennessee that speaks to the standing culture in that area? The materials that are available regionally, as well as economics and trade, industry. You mentioned time period, you mentioned religion. All of those things can be used in your explanation of an object to help make a point. So, how do we do this more often? Practice analysis by writing about their findings as the kind of analyzer of the object. The more comfortable a student is discussing objects in context and answering questions about them, the easier it'll be for them to use them in their projects. I think that's the benefit, or kind of the little bit easier to jump off of a letter, a postcard, a photograph, right? It's easy to use a picture from a protest in the civil rights movement in Nashville and be like, okay, well, we see the people there, but there's also the person holding the camera. Why was that person there? Why did they have a camera ready? There's easier ways to look for perspectives there, but it's harder with, a vase. So how do we get them comfortable talking about them? And I think it's practicing writing with authority. Um, the State Museum resource that he shared, practice your descriptions, those context pieces that can be used to practice talking about an object, which would be important for several of the category types. If you're telling and not showing, if you're a paper, performance, as well as website, documentary, and what am I forgetting? Exhibit is, I guess, a little easier because you have the ability to show an object sometimes. I like the activity writing sample label copy for an exhibit as like a bell ringer, establishing with your students an understanding of how do we write label copy. So label copy is the information that's on a little label with an artifact in a museum, and it's an art in and of itself in the museum world. It's really hard to write label copy that is a wide net most people can understand, that provides context quickly and then speaks to the importance of that specific item. So making it something kids know how to do quickly, as something like a bell ringer, something you do fairly frequently in the classroom, can help build the skill, that muscle of talking about stuff and not just referencing writing or images. Some resources that I found, I'm going to share these slides as a PDF so that you can click them. But I was going to show you a couple things outside of the resources that the State Museum has to offer. And they also have stuff on this on their junior curator blog. I'm going to let Chris speak to some of the other stuff they have going on there too. But I was looking for some things that line up with these activities. And the Penn Libraries, the University of Pennsylvania, has quite a few things that I found really helpful. How to select an object for research. I thought this was a really interesting page to use to help you understand how to kind of practice this in the classroom. They have a page for sample label copy. And there's an activity they have too, object history assignment, where students have to only write about an object and its history. The National Portrait Gallery has a label text activity. Again, this is portraiture, which is a little different than other types of 3D objects. It's a little easier, I think, but it's a good way to kind of jump into that too. And this activity you can use and bounce off of the kind of flow of the activity for your own content area. And then examples in your textbook. I taught 6th grade ancient civ, so most of what I talked about was stuff and making inferences about communities based on the stuff that they left behind. So talk to your 6th grade and 7th grade social studies teachers because they probably have some things that you could use in the classroom, objects that are familiar to students, especially if they're, I don't know, a freshman now. Sometimes it's fun to call back to those older classes and try see what you can remember. But practicing that skill of writing about stuff. All right. There was something else I wanted to point out really quickly. Let me pull up oh, that's the wrong one.
Nikki, while you're pulling that up,
Yeah,
we do have a question that those sources that you pointed out, those are in the Padlet, correct?
they will be.
Okay.
So this is the general educator toolkit that links to this Padlet, which is here, but also like everything else that we do. On it, you'll be able to find, sorry, I know it looks chaotic, but it's the easiest way to organize things sometimes. This is the curriculum and resource website that I'd had a folder for a long time that had everything in it and it turned into a spaghetti monster. So I needed to organize it in a way that was easy to navigate. So in your project basics, I think it's here, there is a couple sheets about historical context. And this is one that I think is helpful. The historical context helper helps you understand context, but it can also be applied to the context of an object. So this could be reworked to be able to explore an object specifically. And then there should be another one here, but I might be lying to you. Analyzing my history day topic. This is topic specific, but it asks questions of that topic, and those questions could be applied towards an object. The last thing I'll point out is I like exploring objects like a museum does. I think that's the benefit of working with a museum on these types of activities because that's what they do all day, every day. They look at stuff and tell people about the past through the lens of that item. So look into accession material. That's the term of taking an item into a collection at a museum. They ask so many questions of that item to be able to put it into storage and understand it and be able to use it later. So practicing just even the basics of describing an item, like Chris was talking about. What is it made of? How is it heavy? Is it light? Is it worn? Is it, like you said, damaged intentionally or unintentionally? Is it worn over time? Does it look brand new even though it's 300 years old? What does that say about the object? I think this could be paired with a QFT if you're familiar with the question formulation technique, where you just pepper with questions for 2 minutes and you ask every single question you can of an object and then pare down from there. I know this is a lot of like ask questions and then practice, but I feel like with stuff in projects, it's really the confidence to be able to talk about it and place the item in the context of those people, that event, that time period, and then okay, so what? How are we using that object to make a point? Um, and objects are about the people that had them and used them and made them. So that's the benefit of them is they are a direct correlation of the human experience, and that's how they can help your History Day projects. Chris, I was going to ask you to share how can they find about traveling trunks. I'll stop my share so you can share if you'd like.
Yeah. Uh,
And how can they come see you at the museum? Or I know that you offer virtual programs too.
yes, we do. So a couple of ways, if you can see my screen there.
Hmm.
Um, so this is our main website. So this is a great landing page for anything museum related that you may be interested in. And I can take you through and show you a few different, there's a print shop going in the video there. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is we have a search our collection. Oh, apparently I'm in the video. Look at that. So we have if you wanted to search our collection, if you're looking for images of 3D objects, you can just go to exhibitions and collections, and it's right there. Search our collection. Scroll down, there's another link, and you can just type in whatever it is you're looking for. But actually, you mentioned, images of the sit-ins and protests and things like that. We also have the various categories here. If you go to online exhibits, just to kind of talk a little bit about the difference between an image versus a 3D object, preserving African American history. Scroll down, and here we've got a chair that was actually in one of these lunch counters in Nashville, where a sit-in took place. This was a chair that a protester sat in to help protest that kind of treatment. And it's on display upstairs in the museum as well. But you can bring this in and, you show that image of the sit-in, show the chair that someone was actually in. It does have this information about it, so it gives you some context that you could have to help guide your students. And that again, it deepens that connection. It provides a little more context. And then if you want to scroll up, and we have a chair here, child's chair, that was made by an enslaved woman and created there. So what's the difference there? What are some similarities between these two chairs? What are some connections that could be made? So if you're looking for at least images of objects, that we can do through our Search Our Collection. If you are more interested, well, there we go. Let me back up. If you are looking for something like our trunk, you want something physically on hand, under our education tab, we have our traveling trunks here. And we have 13, I want to say. We just added a new one, trunk topics that you can take a look at. So, for example, daily life on the frontier. You can pull this up. Some of the highlights include we have raw materials like cotton, flax, and wool. There is a chamber pot in there. We have some of the animal skins. We have cotton cards. Honestly, some of those things I showed you are going to be in pictures of that are going to be in this trunk. You can reserve that if you want to download the lesson plan and read through it so you can see if it actually matches up with what your students have. But you can request this. Click on reserve a trunk, fill out a form that goes to our outreach coordinator, and she will find a time to get this to your classroom. And it comes with lesson plans, like I said, you can download. If you don't want to use those lesson plans, that's fine. We don't get offended by that at all. You are welcome to use the materials that are in the trunk to enhance the lesson plans you already have going on. So feel free to do that. And this is kind of not really what it's intended for, but that sheet I showed you earlier with those objects, that's under our virtual field trips. Those sheets go with each one of the different topics. So if you go to classes featuring artifacts, obviously you can sign up for one of these virtual classes. And like I said, we will hold these up to a camera. We will let the students observe them. We'll kind of lead them through some of those questions and help them analyze these objects and then try to put that story together. But if you also just want the information packets that had the pictures, that's what I showed you earlier. These give you pictures and a description of what the objects are, which don't do this with your students before you do the virtual, because otherwise they will know what they all are. But if you just want to show these to your students, you can do that as well and download that information also. But if you just want to, sign up for one of our virtual programs, these are offered on Mondays for us because the museum is closed, so we can actually be up in the galleries and things like that. But classes featuring artifacts, and we will show these objects off and help lead your students through, and we'll do that for about 30 minutes or so. And we will do them as many times as you need to throughout the day if you have switching classes and things like that. So yeah, there's definitely some opportunities we try to make it as useful as possible. Obviously, the best thing to do would be show up on site where we have everything up in cases and organized already. So you can definitely come on a field trip and observe these objects in the museum themselves. You can do that either through self-guided or scavenger hunts with your students, or you can choose guided programs that are based on specific topics. So, for example, First Peoples, if you are really wanting to focus on prehistoric Native Americans in Tennessee, we have a program where one of our educators will take you through, show off these artifacts, and help put those objects into context for you, along with your students. So we definitely have lots of ways that we are trying to help you guys interact with objects, and we would be more than happy if you use these. They're all free, by the way.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I find most fun about doing object analysis is that it makes the history field feel a little more real for students. As a kid that loved this kind of stuff, but never understood what I could do with this type of learning in the real world after school, I think this is a great way to make connections with not only history, but also how those skills are used as a profession. And sometimes it makes it a little more fun. I've helped with field trips before where students wear the white gloves when you're handling an object. If you're doing, even if it's not something you necessarily have to use them for, it makes it feel like an activity or something fun for the day. So have them pretend to be a museum professional the first couple times you're interacting with an object in person. Um, or getting those objects in trunks like from the state museum to be able to practice physically as well. There was a question, the object analysis page you shared, is it on the website or is there a way to get it where I can share it on the Padlet?
I can definitely send it to you so you can include it on the Padlet. That is not available necessarily on the website because it doesn't make a lot of sense without the object. So we use it in our class here. But I will absolutely share that with you, Nikki, and you can get
Yeah,
it out uh, with the rest of the information with this going along with this worksheet workshop.
yeah. Well, I am gonna stop the recording now. But if you are watching the recording, be sure to fill out the PD form on the Padlet to make sure that you get the certificate. And if I don't get it to you quickly, please email me and let me know I owe it to you.